not PC enough, so we called it Demystifying Parliamentary Procedures. But I'm the type that likes to be a little self-deprecating on some of these things. So it's my experience that in lots of organizations that purport to use Robert's rules, they don't use them properly, they don't use them correctly. People that are participating don't understand them, so you end up with almost the worst of all worlds, where the rules are used improperly, irregularly, and partially, and that results in lousy meeting. So hopefully today I'll explain. I'm not going to get into all the fine nitty-gritty details, but give you the fundamentals, and hopefully it'll all make sense to you, and you'll be better prepared to be a correct participant under a Robert's Rules meeting in the future. So I guess the first thing is, why bother? Well, Robert's Rules are generally specified in the bylaws of all sorts of nonprofit organizations. And I just did a quick Google search the other day, and there are more than 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the U.S. And that's just one category of organizations that use Robert's Rules. Things like, the New York State GS Association conducts its business rules under Robert's Rules of Order. All sorts of local government bodies, town councils, city councils, the planning board, the zoning board of appeals, the school committee, you name it. Chances are exceedingly high that they're operating under Robert's Rules. So if you want to know how to be a participant in those things, you really need to know Robert's Rules. And to me, it's one of those life skills, like good table manners. Knowing how to participate in a Robert's Rules meeting is something you're almost assuredly going to need to know, and yet a shockingly low percentage of people that show up at these things actually do know the rules, and it's kind of a shame. So I think it's here we are in the new year. This is one of those small incremental self-improvement things that you can undertake with minimal effort and be better for it. So that's my little soapbox on why you should care about this. All right, so here's the outline. I'm going to give you a little bit of history, talk about the dynamics of meetings and how those impact what we do with Robert's Rules. The really important part is the underlying principles, because everything else just follows those principles and just implements those principles. And then we'll go through some of the mechanics, roles, and how motions work, how you vote, how you debate, and then some tips and shortcuts, and we'll wrap it up at that point. Okay, so how did these all start? Well, here is the guy. This is Henry Martin Robert. He was a military man, was in the Civil War, wearing a blue uniform for the Union Army. And in the post-Reconstruction period of the Civil War, he, in his military duties, was traveling all around, as a colonel at that time in the engineering corps of the U.S. Army. And he participated in lots and lots of community gatherings and meetings. And as he traveled around, he was shocked to find out that there was no standard way to conduct meetings, and resolved to do something about that. And he studied a lot of like how the British parliamentary procedures worked, which are kind of the origins of a lot of this, but he simplified it and Americanized it to a large extent. And he published this little manual called the Pocket Manual of Rules of Order for Deliberative Assemblies in 1876. That was the first edition. And it became a very popular thing. And he spent the rest of his life kind of evangelizing on these rules. He stayed in the military until, I think he retired in like 1901 or 1902, something like that. He retired as a general. So he had an illustrious military career, but nobody knows him for that. He's only known for the set of meeting rules that he developed. And those rules are a living set of rules. They've continued to evolve. They're not stuck in the past. There have been a total of 11 revisions, the most recent of which is a 2011 revision, which was a very substantial revision, by the way. And the family was actively the owner of these rules until through the 1950s. and then they established something called the Council of Robert's Rules Association. So it's a non-profit association that owns the copyrights to Robert's Rules of Order, and that's who keeps this stuff. Let me go to the next slide here. This is a bit of a chronology, so you can see the editions. The first 3 editions are generally referred to as just Robert's Rules of Order. The next 3 are referred to as Robert's Rules of Order Revised. And then all the revisions since then have been called Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised. Those are the title changes. And that's significant in a minor way, because if your bylaws reference Robert's Rules of Order Revised, unfortunately you're stuck with the 1951 edition. But that's one of those nitty-gritty things that nobody cares about. So the family and the heirs to the family owned them up through that 6th edition in 1951. A lot of what you see published now, when you go to the bookstore, you go to the library, and there's all kinds of publications on Robert's Rules. Almost all of those are based on expired copyrights. The copyrights on these last for 73 years, and so that means the first whatever it is, 4 or 5 editions, the copyrights have expired on, and that's what most of what you find at the bookstore are based on. Those expired copyrights. Everything that's under current copyright is protected and is owned by that Council of Robert's Rules Association. And so the only authoritative book on Robert's Rules of Order is the one published by the Council on Robert's Rules Association. And guess what? They don't list Robert's Rules. The rules are not published online. The association funds itself by selling the book. So chances are, if you go looking around and you get all these little paperbacks and whatever, they're not the right rules. You really need to buy the official book from the Robert's Rules, the Council on Robert's Rules Association. All right, enough of that. Most association bylaws, and in fact the laws on the books, the statutory rules for which local governments operate on, have language in there like this that says, the rules contained in the current edition of Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised shall govern the society in all cases applicable in which they are not inconsistent with these bylaws and any special rules that the society may adopt. So that's, when you see that in an association's bylaws, that means that they are referencing the official Robert's Rules as the procedures that they're going to follow. Okay. I'd like to start with a kind of a tongue-in-cheek definition. A meeting is a gathering of 2 or more people where minutes are kept and hours are lost. I know that is so true of so many meetings, that they drag on, they don't accomplish what they set out to accomplish. And if you follow Robert's Rules, that's generally not going to be the case. A Robert's Rules meeting is very orderly, has specific orders of business, has specific ways to get to a decision, nice orderly way to get to a decision, and hopefully this definition will not be met if you follow the rules well. Okay, so we've all been in lots of meetings, and lots of things can go wrong. I love that Robert's Rules refers to something called a deliberative assembly. So just think about that for a second. What is a deliberative assembly? It's a group of people that have come together to do something, to accomplish something. So this is not happy hour. It's not just coming together to chit-chat. You can do that and socialize. That's fine, but that's not a deliberative assembly. That's not a business meeting. So when you have business to conduct and decisions to make, that's when these rules should be used. That's when you're going to be having a deliberative assembly. And generally speaking, the larger the group of members that are in this deliberative assembly, the more important it is to follow the rules well, because you have a lot more opportunity for things to come off the rails in a big crowd of people, where there's more likely to be people unruly or disruptive or trying to take the conversation in a different direction and all of those things, which leads to some of these other on here. So you've all been in meetings where there's somebody that's loud and boisterous that tends to dominate the meeting. And you've also, I'm sure, been in lots of meetings where you started to go down one path to be making a decision on something, and you ended up getting diverted down a tangent, down a rabbit hole, so to speak, and maybe never even get back to where the thing had started. And when you follow Robert's rules, you'll see that things do have a way to keep you on track and not lose that focus. And also, when you make a decision, you want it to be very clear that you have made a decision, and everybody knows that a decision is made, and they know what the decision is. And that's often lacking in a meeting. So all of these things are dealt with in the rules. And it's very important that under Robert's rules, it's really the will of the majority that's happening here, not the will of the loudest. And even if you're in the minority view always has rights, always has the ability to be heard and expressed and participate in the process. So it's a really good democratic process. It's a really good consensus process that leads to a formal decision. All right, so here let's take a little time going through this, because the basic principles, and the abbreviation is Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised. That's how they abbreviate as RONR. So you'll see that in a few places where I didn't want to type out the full name here. But under Robert's rules, the group only working on one item at a time. That's very important. So the whole issue of tangents and getting distracted. There are ways to revise and amend, and we'll be talking about that. But you always come back to the point where you departed. So that fork in the road, you go down it as necessary. You deal with whatever that tangent was, and then you come back to that same point and resume your travel down the road. When you're working on a motion, which is the way you make a decision, everything is subject to free and open debate, and it's an orderly debate. That is, people aren't just shouting out. There are limitations and controls to make sure that it is an orderly debate, but it is a free and open debate, so it's very democratic. This is really important. You only debate an issue when there's a motion. If you don't want to reach a decision and you just want to have an open discussion, that's fine. You can do that. But open discussions don't lead decisions. If you want to have a debate and reach a decision, you do that under the context of a motion. So that's the only place you're debating under a Roberts meeting. Everybody has equal rights, but there's some limitations on that, which you'll see a little bit later on. It has to do with what constitutes the deliberative assembly. Because it's a democratic process, you're always going to make decisions based on the will of the majority. But hopefully, the way the process works is there's ways to amend and perfect so that you reach as close a consensus as possible before you actually take the vote. So a good Roberts Rules process is one where the debate informs and revises the motion, and you end up with a better motion than you started out with that's agreeable to more people before you're voting to pass it. Okay, and then as I said earlier, the rights of the minority are always there throughout the whole process. All right, so that's the underlying principles of the thing. Is that everybody can engage. We're going to do what the will of the majority is. We're going to have a vigorous debate that's going to inform the membership to create that will of the majority. Nowadays we generally call it consensus seeking. Roberts refers to it as perfecting the motion. Okay. Next thing is, okay, when you're having a deliberative assembly, bylaws almost always specify that the meeting can only occur when there is a quorum, that is a minimum number of members present. And that's something that the bylaws typically specify. It's very often a majority of the members, but it could be some other number. And for the GIS Association, for example, I don't even know off the top of my head what the quorum is. But you need to have a quorum before you can begin conducting a Roberts Rules meeting. If the quorum isn't defined in the bylaws, it is by definition in Roberts a majority of members. And the assumption is that in a deliberative assembly, everybody is meeting together. Now, of course, in Henry Martin's day, that meant everybody was in the room together. Nowadays, there's a lot of interest in having meetings conducted under the rules that invite remote participation. And this is, in fact, something that can and does regularly happen with Robert's Rules, but there's a couple of important things you need to know. First of all, you know, a not-for-profit organization is incorporated under the laws of some state. So, you know, in the New York State Jazz Association is an incorporated entity operating under the laws of New York State. And in New York State, they allow quorums to consist of members remotely present via electronic means. So it is allowed in New York State. I think there may be states that's not the case, but I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV and won't pretend to know. But it does something that is important to understand, that it be allowed in the jurisdiction that your laws you're under. For it to be valid, it has to allow real-time two-way communication, because the only way you can really be a participant in a Robert's Rules meeting is if you can hear and participate fully in the debate and the actions of the assembly. And that doesn't happen, for example, by email. So people say, oh, you know, we're going to allow email voting. Well, email voting means that you don't have an option for participation in the debate, which is supposed to occur before you vote. And so that's not real-time two-way communication, and that's not the kind of thing that's legit under Robert's Rules. Okay, so a little bit about the roles. Everybody in a Robert's meeting has a particular role to play. The first thing is to understand that when a deliberative assembly is meeting, it's generally a meeting of the members of the organization. So, for example, when the GIS Association had its meeting at the conference in Saratoga back in the fall, we had a business meeting of the association there. There were people in the room that may have been sponsors or may have been visitors or students that were not members of the association. Well, under Robert's Rules, they can, you know, the bylaws of the association are always the controlling thing here. They would supersede Robert's Rules. Remember that language I read early on about how you build into your bylaws language to adopt Robert's Rules, and it says we're not in conflict with these bylaws. So you can have things in your bylaws that state whether or not non-members can participate in a meeting. But absent such provisions, only the members have rights to participate in the meeting of an organization. Everybody else is an observer and is there, you know, to observe, and has no particular right to enter into the debate, to make motions, to vote. So that's important to understand from the get-go too, because it's very typical for there to be non-members present, and unless you clear the room of the non-members, you have to. The presiding officer should be careful not to extend those rights to people that don't have a right to them. Okay. Under a Robert's meeting, the presiding officer is the one who is in control of all the actions. So they run the meeting. And in order to run a meeting effectively under Robert's Rules, the presiding officer really needs to have a decent handle on how the rules work, because they're playing traffic cop on the meeting. And everyone else that's participating in the meeting is obliged to obey the controls of the presiding officer. The presiding officer is normally advised by a parliamentarian, so if they're not sure what to do, the parliamentarian should be sitting close by and can quick whisper instructions to them or whatever. In a lot of cases, the presiding officer functions as their own parliamentarian, which means that they should have a solid working knowledge of the rules, so they don't have to pause and go look things up in the book. But you know, it's not the worst thing in the world to have to stop and do that. The secretary of the organization would be the one that records the meeting. And interestingly enough, minutes of an organization under Robert's Rules only need to record the decisions made. They don't need to record who made the motion, what discussion points were made about the motion. They're simply an official record of what decisions were reached in a Robert's Rules meeting. Now, nothing wrong with recording more than that, but the only specific requirement for meeting minutes is that they record the decisions made. And as I mentioned earlier, typically with a larger meeting, you're going to want to be more vigilant about following the rules more strictly. A smaller meeting can generally be a little less formal. No need for a lot of formality. We got, a board meeting with 8 or 9 people as opposed to a full assembly with 200 people in the room. Very different dynamics there. There's always an agenda that determines the order of business. We'll talk about that in a minute. If it's not specified in the bylaws what the meeting agenda is, Robert's Rules has its own meeting agenda that would then take over. And it's equally important to knowing how Robert's Rules work is to know what your bylaws say, because the bylaws supersede Robert's Rules in all cases. So if you're a presiding officer, your first obligation is to know what's in your bylaws. And then your second obligation is to either know the parliamentary procedures yourself or have a parliamentarian sitting close by who can advise you. All right. Now, this is a typical meeting agenda here. That animation shouldn't have been happening there. Well, okay, never mind. That little highlight box on my original slide deck comes in on a second mouse click, but I guess we lost that under the WebEx here. But here's the meeting agenda that's specified in Robert's bylaws. Don't have a different order of business. This is the order of business. There's a call to order that officially starts the meeting. There's reading and approval of minutes from the previous meeting of the organization. They don't generally have to be read. Nowadays, what they typically are done is distributed ahead of time by email or whatever. And so you simply ask are there any corrections? The idea is that people that participate in the organization always have the opportunity to review and correct the minutes before they become officially adopted. And then there are reports of standing committees, reports of special committees. Most of the work of an organization typically happens in the next two things, which are unfinished business, which I see over and over again referred to as old business, which is wrong. It's not old business. Old business implies, musty cobwebs, you're dredging up stuff that's already been done. No, you're finishing unfinished business before you start anything new. So it's unfinished business is next, and then you don't introduce anything new until you've wrapped up what was left dangling from the previous meeting as unfinished business, and then you can adjourn. All right. Now, how you make a decision all happens through the process called a motion. And this is really the critical part of knowing how to work a Robert's Rules meeting, is how things happen in a motion. And a motion can be made by any member. And the way a member makes a motion is they need to be recognized by the presiding officer. Generally, they raise their hand. They want the attention of the presiding officer. And they would rise and address the group and say, I move that. Now, you don't have to be real formal about how you state the thing, but what's going to happen is that the wording is going to be repeated so that we have a specific decision statement that can be answered by a yes or no vote. Okay, so you're proposing that we raise the dues from $50 to $75, or you're moving that we're going to have a motion that we're going to limit debate to no more than 10 minutes on the next subject. Whatever the motion is, somebody has to rise or be recognized and state a motion. The next thing that has to happen is somebody else in the room has to want for there to be a process to continue that idea. If nobody else in the room is interested in the thing that was just moved, then it dies. And off you go. So this is the way that you prevent these extraneous things from being dealt with. If it's an idea that nobody else cares about, it shouldn't get seconded, and it dies immediately. If it is seconded, we now have a motion, and what the presiding officer should do is repeat the motion, typically tweaking the wording, making it into a nice phrase that can then be recorded in the minutes. This is the motion that we're dealing with, okay? So that everybody in the room now has a clear statement of a motion that we're now going to debate. So that's the really important start of a motion, is that everybody has to know what it is, and there has to be at least 2 people in the room that want to deal with it. Once that motion has been stated and seconded and restated, it is now open for debate. And every motion is open to debate. before a vote is taken. In fact, it's improper for a vote to be taken while there's anyone interested in debating it. And so here's the key points about a motion. The motion, first of all, is not owned by the person that stated it. That's very often assumed, and it's incorrect. Once a motion has been seconded and restated, it is owned by the full assembly. There is no owner. The whole group owns that motion now. And everybody is free, everybody that's a member is free to speak to it. And the way they do that is they ask to be recognized. Put your hand up or whatever, and the presiding officer should then invite debate. And that debate should, to the extent that the presiding officer can anticipate who's wishing to speak for it, should recognize people speaking both for and against it. The whole idea is that you're informing the membership, and you're now going to be leading to something on the next slide where we can perfect it, that is, change or tune the motion. But I'll get to that in a minute. So once the debate has ended, and the debate can end in one of two ways. It can end because everybody that wished to enter into the debate is done. So if there's nobody else wishing to speak, we can now take the vote. Or we can have a motion to end debate. And a motion to end debate would have to be passed by a 2/3 majority. We'll get to that in a minute too. That's called calling the question. You may have heard that phrase before. So once the debate ends, either on its own or via a motion, the chair then restates the motion and takes the vote. Now, that's as simple as that. Now, so that whole action of debate is what we just were talking about. I want to get into a little bit more detail here. So first of all, I think I've already said this, but I want to repeat it, that you need to be a member in good standing to enter into the debate. The presiding officer can choose to recognize non-members, but their comments are not, they have no right to make such comments. So the presiding officer should have an ability to recognize who can and cannot participate in the debate. The presiding officer also is the one who controls who is speaking. So nobody is entitled to just shout out catcalling or responding while someone else is being recognized. Only one person has the floor at a time, and that person who has the floor has been given the privilege of the floor by the presiding officer. That's important. Again, the presiding officer recognizes pros and cons. If you're entering into the debate, you're addressing the whole assembly. You're not up there to say, and I don't, what Joe Schmo over there said is, that guy is an idiot, he's wrong, you shouldn't listen to him. That's improper. All of the comments in a debate are issue and are addressed to the full assembly. They're not for personal calling out of individuals. In a debate, if there's nothing in your bylaws or the organization has not passed any motion about limitations on debate, by default, anybody can speak no more than twice on a motion and for no more than 10 minutes each time. And that doesn't mean you can speak once for 20 minutes, and it doesn't mean you can choose not to speak and give your time to somebody else. Neither of those are allowed. So unless there's something else in the bylaws or that the association has passed, this is it. So it's twice up to 10 minutes each. All right, so now when a debate is occurring, it very often is the case that points are raised that would suggest that this motion would be better if we changed it in some way. If we added a provision that, raising the dues from 50 to 75 should exclude the senior members or the lifetime members or the students or something like that. Okay, so there is always the ability to amend the motion, and this is a really good thing, because this is how we, quote, perfect the motion or reach consensus. We can make changes to it that make it more amenable to the group. And how do we do that? Well, you're actually making a motion to amend. So someone says, puts their hand up during the debate and says, Mr. Chairman, I wish to amend this motion to exclude students from this dues increase. And like any other motion, it needs to be seconded. And then the presiding officer will repeat that, and then that particular amendment is debated. So debate ends on the original motion, and we now debate this amendment to exclude students. So anybody can speak for and against. When the debate is done on that, you then take the vote on that particular amendment. Passes, the motion is then officially changed. So now we have a new motion that we're going to raise dues from $50 to $75 except for students. Okay, maybe it's not the best example in the world, but that's how the process works. Now, Roberts allows for an amendment to be amended. So you can be kind of in two steps into it, but that's it. You can't go 3 steps in. So somebody could say, I want to amend the student amendment that they must be, a currently matriculated student. And so, that amendment to the amendment can be debated and voted on and so forth. You following along, I hope? What we sometimes hear in organizations is they'll say, I want to make a friendly amendment. And what they mean by that is, I want to ask the person who made the original motion if they're okay with this. And that is absolutely not the way Roberts works. I see this all the time in meetings of organizations. They say, John over there made the motion. John, are you okay if we exclude students? As if John owns the motion. He does not own the motion. And so there's a better way to deal with that, and I'm going to explain that in a subsequent slide. But that friendly amendment thing is totally illegit. Not going to get into this, but there are different categories of motions. This is something a parliamentarian would want to know more about. These have orders of precedence, so you can have a privileged motion, can happen that overrides, discussion on a main motion and so forth. But I'm not going to get into this. This is more than we need to talk about today. Next thing is we finished debate, and so now we want to take the vote. So how does that work? Well, again, your bylaws are always the first thing to look for. The bylaws may specify how votes are going to be taken. Say we're going to have by written ballot, or we're going to have it by raised hands, or they're going to be secret ballots, or whatever it is. So you have to follow the bylaws. But if there's not, then the chair or the presiding officer has the discretion to determine what type of vote to take. And it could be just a voice vote, all in favor say aye, or it could be a show of hands, or it could be a standing count. We say all in favor, please stand, and then those opposed stand and you count them, or it could be by ballot. So all of that is at the discretion of the presiding officer. And again, it would be based on the type of vote being taken. A good presiding officer will not fall for more formality than is appropriate. No need to have a ballot vote on something simple, right? So then the chair would then take the vote. The affirmative vote is always asked for first, then the negative vote, and then you announce the results. So if it's been a voice vote or a show of hands vote and it looks close or it sounds close, any member can say, I want a counted vote. I want a so-called division of the House. And that action of requesting a division or counted vote requires the presiding officer do a counted vote. For example, count the hands or rise and do a standing vote. So that there should never be confusion about or belief that, there were more nays than yays, but the chair declared it passed and you have no recourse. No, you do have recourse. Again, that's part of those protecting the rights of the minority. You can always call for that counted vote. Under Robert's rules, almost all decisions only need a simple majority to pass. But it's important that you know that a 2/3 majority is needed for anything which limits the rights of members. So, remember we said you can take a vote to end debate early? Well, ending debate early means that you're cutting off the rights of members who wanted to speak to a debate. That requires a 2/3 vote. So anything that's going to, another example is ejecting a member. I've actually never been in a meeting where this happened, but you could take a vote to eject an unruly member and bar them from participation. It would require a 2/3 vote. So that's the key thing to recognize there. All right. So here's some of the points that can make the thing move a little more quickly. If you want if you want the vote taken, that is, you want to end debate, you want to take that the motion to end debate is sometimes referred to as calling the question. So somebody, this happens a lot of meetings. So the debate will be ongoing, and somebody in the group thinks we've had enough debate. I'm tired of hearing this debate, and they'll say, "I call the question." And what that really means is I am making a motion to end debate. So a second would be you need a second, and then there's no debate on that motion. You take a second to know that somebody else did end it, and then the presiding officer takes that vote to end the debate. It has to be 2/3, and if that's the case, then you vote on the actual motion. It can be confusing because people might think when you're voting to call the question that they're voting on the actual motion, the motion to raise dues from 50 to 75. No, you're only voting that first time to end the debate. So here's where, a good presiding officer explains that. So the presiding officer says, look, no, folks, just to be clear, we're voting now to end debate. And if this vote passes, we will then vote on the motion to raise the dues. Okay. Another way motions can be disposed of or handled is something called tabling. So you can make a motion, table a motion, and what it actually means is to take away from the table. And what it really means is you're deferring it. And a proper motion to table also states when it would be reintroduced. So you might say, Mr. Chair, I move that we table this motion until next year's annual meeting. And then if there's a second and that vote passes, what that means is that motion will then automatically be reconsidered at the next meeting of the organization. As that's what tabling means. Sometimes that's done so that a committee can study it further, or people have more time to think about the implications of it, or whatever. If it looks like it needs more time, that's the way to do it, is to table it. It doesn't mean you're voting it down. It means you're deferring the vote. That's all. Reconsider means if a motion passes, but somebody wants to dredge it up again. They say, you say you've just passed the motion to raise the dues. It can be reconsidered the same day or the next day, but only by the prevailing side. So think about that. So if after the motion passes, you're thinking like, oh crap, we weren't thinking about our senior citizens members who are on a fixed income when we might be driving them out of the organization. And I wish we'd have thought of that. So the prevailing side can say, I want to make a motion to reconsider our previous vote, and that would allow it to be reintroduced. But notice that the losing side doesn't have the ability to do that. That's important. Otherwise, motions would continually be reintroduced by the losing side because they want to keep having it revoted on. You can also refer a motion to a committee. You can say, I think our membership committee should prepare a recommendation before we vote on this, and that's a legitimate way to handle a motion. Point of order is a motion that simply asks, if someone in the group thinks that we're not following the proper rules of order, they can make a point of order, and that forces the parliamentarian to weigh in on whether or not, and sometimes they would have to look things up in the handbook and so forth, but it's the way to enforce, to ask for enforcement of the rules is to make a point of order. And another thing is called a point of information. So if you're not sure, you say, you're confused about, are we debating the amendment or are we debating the main thing? You can ask for a point of information and ask the presiding officer to please clarify what it is that you're working on. And that's a perfectly good thing to do to make sure, because if you're confused, good chance that other members are confused as well. So it's a good way to clarify that, is to raise a point of information. All right, so here are some shortcuts. The most important one by far is this top one. So, and this is really slick, because what you can do is you can dispense with voting thing if you simply say, if there is no objection. So when a motion to amend is made, for example, somebody wants to make that amendment to exclude students from the dues increase, you can say, if there are no objections to this motion, and you look around the room and nobody is indicating any objection, it can be adopted that way. Because if there's not going to be any opposition, you dispense with the formality of a debate and a vote on something that everybody already agrees with. This is a wonderful, wonderful shortcut and should be used at all times. What you don't want to use it for is to avoid voting on a main motion. What it's best used for is amendments. So this is how you handle amendments smoothly and efficiently. Is if it's an obvious good change and nobody has any problems with it, ask if there are objections, and if there aren't any, you adopt it. Okay. The friendly amendment, I think I beat that horse enough. We know there's no such thing. If an amendment is appears to be very divisive, and it looks like a vote to this thing is going to be something that's going to create hard feelings and divide the organization, you can have a motion to withdraw and actually remove the motion from consideration from the assembly. Again, this would have to be voted on, but it's a way to extract the motion from consideration. Another thing that I think works well in a lot of situations is to take a straw poll. So if the presiding officer isn't sure, are we getting closer to consensus in this debate, they can say, folks, I just want a quick straw poll. How, if we were to take the vote right now, how many of you are thinking you would? This is non-binding, mind you, but how many of you think you'd be voting in favor? Just an informal straw poll that's not recorded in the minutes. It is not a decision, but it gives the parliamentarian or the presiding officer an ability to kind of gauge, gives everybody in the room a sense to gauge how we're doing, and are we getting closer to consensus? Are we getting further apart? Perfectly good way to do things. You can actually do business by suspending the rules. Again, this is something that requires a 2/3 vote, but you could vote to dispense with the rules to do something that would otherwise normally not be allowed under Robert's rules. I don't have a good example of that, but it's a way. I know some organizations, when they want to do something that would violate the rules, they pass a motion to suspend the rules for the next order of business, and then they do what it is they're going to do, and then they come back. And the whole business of a problem member that is ignoring the instructions from the presiding officer to they're speaking quickly, or they won't stop talking when they are supposed to, or they're interrupting. You can call for a motion to eject. That would be really rare, and hopefully you wouldn't have to do that, but it is possible. Okay. So that's hopefully the key points that I want to get through today. As I mentioned, you can find lots of stuff based on the old expired copyrights, but you're really looking for the official book. They have two versions of it. There's a much smaller condensed version which has most of the highlights in it, and then there's the full book that's about triple the volume that you have to buy from the Robert's Rules organization. It's available on their website. When you click on the link on their website, it takes you to Amazon.com where you buy it, but that's how you get it. The website, by the way, which is robertsrules.com, is a great site, and they have a really good section of frequently asked questions, which is often easier than looking things up, trying to look up things in the handbook. You can just go to the FAQs. And if you have some thorny issue, you can pose a question, and the panel of authors that are behind the official publication of Robert's Rules will answer it. But I think one of the best ways to learn is to observe someone who knows how to use the rules. You kind of learn by example, I think, is the best way to do it. And there's some fairly arcane things that rarely happen, that that there's a lot of pages in the volumes of Robert's Rules on. But for the most part, the main steps of the process are pretty straightforward, pretty clear, pretty easy to follow, and when you do follow them, meetings go very smoothly. So this is what the website looks like, just for your information. And that's all I have. So at this point, what I'm going to do is see if anybody's got their hand raised. And I don't see any hands raised, and I don't see any questions in the chat section here. But if anybody does have a question, now would be the time. And Mickey, I don't know if you can unmute the phone to do that, or how we would do it. But I'm not seeing any raised hands. So that means either you fell asleep for the whole thing, or it was so crystal clear that you have no questions. Now we're getting some. So I got, let's start with Alan Leidner. Mickey, how does this work? Do you unmute them?
Let me see if I can turn their voice on right now. Okay, I'm going to turn Al on and see if we can hear him right now.
Okay, you're up, Al.
Nope.
Nothing yet, Mickey.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Alan, are you able to talk yet? No. Not working yet, Mick.
Okay, hang on one second.
All right. Well, while you're working on the audio, I see a couple of them in the chat thing. And so one of them here is asking who keeps the time limits during a debate. So, for example, knowing when somebody spoke more than 10 minutes, that will be the responsibility of the presiding officer. They can delegate that. They can ask somebody to be monitoring the time, but that's really the presiding officer's discretion to do that. Let's see what else we got.
Do you hear me now?
I think this whole session.
Yep.
You heard that?
Al, shut off your phone on your computer.
Shut off the computer? Oh, can you hear me over the phone?
No,
the mic.
the volume.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I just shut off my computer.
Turn the volume off. Mute your volume on your computer.
I just did.
Okay, there you go.
That's perfect now. Good.
Oh, okay. I'm getting feedback, but I can live with that. The question is, at board meetings, we usually proceed somewhat informally, and there's generally consensus in the things we do. There's debate, but then we generally, through comments back and forth, not a formal structured thing, but just a discussion, we arrive at generally consensus. We have a motion, a vote, and most of them are unanimous. Is there any problem with proceeding like that?
Well, notwithstanding the fact that you're violating your bylaws, which require that you operate under Robert's rules. I know they're in the bylaws of the association, so that's a consideration. I strongly advise against doing that sort of an ad hoc informal thing. It's much better. It's cleaner. It's clearer to everybody what you're doing if you start by, when it looks like something is heading towards what would be a decision, stop and ask for a motion and do a controlled debate where the debate, leads to amendments to the motion and so forth. And like I said, generally you can use the without objection shortcut and get to your vote much more quickly. But it's going to be better for everybody. It'll be clearer what you're doing. You'll have an officially recorded decision. You'll have a fair process to get to it, and it won't take you any longer. It's just a better way to do business.
So let me clarify.
Especially for things like the board.
We can start with a subject that we can discuss, informally back and forth. Then that would lead to a motion based on that discussion, and then we could drop into Robert's rules to carry through the debate about the motion.
Yes, you can. That is correct. I would say, though, at a board meeting, a high percentage of what you're going to want to do is probably most appropriately handled under Robert's rules, because you're not just there as a social hour. You're there to conduct business. Mm-hmm. You're there to make decisions about things for the association.
Okay, got it. Good.
All right. Have we answered? I answered your question in the chat. Did you have a further question? Mickey, can you unmute Janet? Oh, she doesn't. She says no. She doesn't have another question. Okay. Glenn Cutter. All right. I see Glenn's question says, instead of amending a motion, is it easier for someone to propose a new motion, or is that allowed? No. Once a motion is made, it's going to have to be handled. So you can amend that motion. We can vote on it. We can table it. We can withdraw it. We can refer it to a committee. We can do one of those things. But we can't just replace it with a new motion while a new motion is on the floor. So that motion is going to reach its conclusion, one of several possible conclusions, and not be replaced by a new motion. Now, it could be that you amend the motion if it's simply because if what you're suggesting is the motion that's out there is clunky and lousily worded. You handle that with an amendment. So amendments can even change the meaning drastically. They just can't introduce an entirely different subject. So what Robert says is the amendments have to be germane. So if it's an amendment about the dues, if it's a motion about the dues, all the amendments have to in some way connect to the dues. You can't be introducing as an amendment something to do with some new topic or unrelated topic. So I hope that answers your question. The question here, Alex is asking, does an amendment need a 2/3 or a majority vote? Just a majority, simple majority. The only time you need 2/3 is for things that limit the rights of members. So ending debate early, for example, is limiting the rights of members. Okay, or an amendment to prevent anybody from speaking more than once during a motion. That would be another limiting of rights. That would take a 2/3 vote. Everything else is by default simple majority. Okay, let me just look here, see if anybody else has their hands up. All right, I don't see any others, and I don't see any additional questions in the chat box. Thank you, everybody. This has been recorded, so Mickey's going to have the recording. I assume will be posted on the site.
Yes.
Oh, I see one more question here. Alan Linder says, does the parliamentarian act through the chair, or does the parliamentarian have authority to speak independently? Now, the chair is the presiding officer. They can refer things, they can ask questions of the parliamentarian, ask for guidance from the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian is not the authority figure in a meeting, it's the presiding officer who is guided by the parliamentarian. Okay. I thank you all. Glad you all participated today. Hope you can be better participants in future meetings.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Bill.